We're pleased to share with you the latest iteration in the FY'24 proposed budget. The last time we presented was 2 weeks ago, and the governor's budget had just been released. So there's been some work happening between now and then to prepare this recommended budget for you this evening. And I want to thank our new Deputy Director for School Finance, Dwelley, who's joining me tonight. In terms of the budget timeline, there had been steps prior to February 15th, including budget development with principals, as well as meetings with individual school committee members to understand your priorities for this budget. It all started in October with a joint meeting with the school committee and town council to kind of set the fiscal forecast. With the governor's budget being released in March and some understanding related to the Student Opportunity Act and its implications for Barnstable, I have an update for you and the community about that this evening. Later on tonight will be the public hearing of the school committee's budget. We are scheduled to have you vote on it at the next regular meeting, which is April 5th, after which it gets submitted to the town manager, ultimately to be proposed to the town council for their appropriation approval. In terms of major budget drivers, what is driving what would be a level service budget, although we are not proposing a level service budget, are wages through our collective bargaining agreements, accounting for inflationary pressures on fuel, facilities maintenance, software licenses, and supplies. And then we're also looking to make sure that we're keeping up with mandated services, particularly in the area of translations and interpretation. As we had noted at previous meetings, there are department requests that came in. We had 96 submissions from 18 cost centers. The total cost of these requests exceeds $4.1 million and was over 47 FTEs. Major submission themes from our principals and directors included supports for English language learners, including family liaisons and translation services, instructional leadership, and paraprofessional support in kindergarten and first grade, although the requests were not limited to those areas. What you'll see tonight are kind of a continuation of what has been previously shared around prioritized budget enhancements, focusing on a few key areas. One being the equitable allocation of resources, so taking a careful look K-3 and looking across our K-3 elementary schools for equity in terms of paraprofessionals and assistant principal support. District-wide, looking to make sure that we're applying teachers for special education and English language learning in an equitable way aligned to student needs. Part of the entry process identified a need for talent development, and so we have some proposed enhancements related to recruitment and retention strategies involving professional development and succession planning. Instructional resources, including curriculum supports and leadership, and funding for facilities planning and space needs. These align with the entry plan findings report that I shared a few weeks ago, and which will shape into longer-term goals for the district. Importantly, the recommended budget that you'll see tonight builds upon the district's plan to fund evidence-based programs to close opportunity and achievement gaps aligned with the Student Opportunity Act. So the recommended operating budget that is before you and in your packet is ultimately a 7.79% increase, which is just under $6 million, which I know is a large ask, but there is a lot of support for this budget coming from the governor in the form of Chapter 70 and the Student Opportunity Act. Based on the revenue and assessments presented in that budget through the Department of Revenue and analyzing that with the town officials related to the 60-40 revenue sharing agreement, there are funds that ought to support this request. Of course, final appropriation, there's a process here for you to support the budget, and of course, final appropriation rests with the town council. The largest area of increase is in salary and wages, and we'll talk through a number of proposed additions to faculty and staff this evening, and we've built in some increases for supplies as well as operating and contracted services. I want to provide a little bit of background because this is a big shift in thinking from the October joint meeting with the town council and the school committee. And so if the community's been following kind of the story of school funding here in Barnstable, I think it's important to take a step back and understand why we're in the position we're in as a result of the Student Opportunity Act. Chapter 70 funding provides state aid for schools, and it's determined by the Department of Education. They define and calculate a foundation budget, which is determined as what is adequate for each district given the specific grades, programs, and demographic characteristics of its students. Then DESE determines what an equitable local contribution would be and how much of that foundation budget should be paid for by each city and town's property tax based on its relative wealth. Relative wealth is calculated based on median income in the community as well as property value. The remainder of the foundation budget is then supported by Chapter 70 state aid. The foundation budget was initially set in 1993 as the minimum level necessary to provide an adequate education for all students. There have been two major resets to this funding level. One came in the 2000s, and more recently with the Student Opportunity Act, they have done a major reset in terms of the foundation budget. It's based on enrollment within your community. That is having a huge, that's a huge factor here in Barnstable in terms of our enrollment changes and our demographic changes. It also takes into account the wages in the region, and so there's an increment in the formula depending upon where in the state you are. And it takes into account inflation. They do cap inflation. I want to say it's somewhere in the 4.5% range, so it does not reflect the current amount of inflation that we're experiencing, although there's been some significant advocacy for the state to fund at real inflation levels. As I noted, the foundation budget was recently reset across the state through the Student Opportunity Act. Based on the recommendations of the Foundation Budget Review Commission, they studied education very deeply in 2015 to determine the cost of educating and noted that there needed to be additional funds and additional support related to economically disadvantaged students, guidance and psychological services that were, as you know, only increasing in schools since the original Ed Reform Act was passed in '93, escalating costs of health insurance and other fixed costs, costs related to students with disabilities, and English learners. The preliminary foundation budget per pupil for FY'24, according to the governor's budget, is just under $16,000 per student, and the preliminary foundation budget is $84.5 million, or an increase of 11.84% from last year. That is a huge increase, and this is not just a one-year increase. This happened last year as well, where there was a large increase to the foundation budget. This does not pertain just to Barnstable Public Schools. This formula does pertain to any public school around which the town of Barnstable is responsible for, so it also includes kind of a small amount related to charter schools as well as technical tuitions. Required local contribution, the essential question that the state asks is how much can Barnstable afford to pay towards the foundation budget? Key factors, as I had noted, relates to property wealth, in terms of land assessments, and the other is local effort from income, and that combines together to give a municipal revenue growth factor, which factors into what they say the community can support. Historically, Barnstable's target aid from Chapter 70 was 17.5%, or the minimum, meaning that the local contribution would make up 82.5% of the budget. That's actually the maximum amount, and it's largely related to the property values here. But again, the the Student Opportunity Act has done a major reset, and you'll see in the overall summary that the state is proposing that 29% roughly would be coming from state aid versus the 17.5% previously. So this is the overall comparison to FY'23 of state funding, and I would point to a couple of things on this slide. First is the enrollment increasing by about 2%. The foundation budget, as I had noted, is increasing nearly $9 million, or 11.84%. That's what the state is saying is an adequate amount to fund education here in Barnstable. The required district contribution is going up 5.1%, or $2.9 million. Chapter 70 aid is going up $6 million, or 32.32%. This is the largest increase for any community in the state. Back in October, when we were operating, we were operating under a much more conservative fiscal model, with Chapter 70 expected to go up $500,000. And instead, the Student Opportunity Act is providing significantly more Chapter 70 aid to Barnstable. The enrollment trends are the major pieces that are factoring into our Chapter 70 funding. As noted, it's related to your student enrollment and demographics. And this is a slide that has been shown, I think, for many years, demonstrating the demographic shifts that are being seen in Barnstable.
I don't think it was quite as colorful, though.
We've updated it. The major pieces here that are contributing most significantly to the increased amount in Chapter 70 is a large increase in the number of students who are economically disadvantaged, which happened 2 years ago. They placed districts in 12 tiers. Barnstable is in the 10th tier, with 61% of students being identified as economically disadvantaged, which is defined as 185% of the federal poverty level. The other increase is related to the increase in English learners, but I think the largest single factor is related to economically disadvantaged population. Joe?
That Chapter 70 is aid for schools from the state generally?
Yeah, the intention is that it is for school funding.
And is that in the process, the way that we do things here, is that earmarked for schools right now, or is that something, will that come directly into the schools?
So that's part of the 60-40 revenue sharing agreement that's been in place for some time, where all of the revenue gets considered, other assessments get considered, and then kind of in a collection, it's determined 60% of the revenue is available to the school department and 40% to municipal operations.
So the state, so the state reformulated things and says basically like the schools need another $6 million, but based on our funding, we might only get 3.6 instead of the 6.
Yeah, so it gets divided up differently. The state can't compel the town to spend all $6 million on the schools. I will also note that health insurance and fixed costs, there is, kind of an allowance, or it is allowable for the town to reserve funding, because there are costs that are borne by the municipal department versus the schools. So some of the money it also recognizes those expenses.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
So some may ask if this is a one-time windfall, or are we going to rely on this? Chapter 70 through the Student Opportunity Act is a 6-year implementation plan, and FY'24 is the 3rd year of the 6-year implementation plan. Last year, Barnstable also saw a significant increase in Chapter 70 funding coming into the town. The state has a pretty healthy financial situation and has been funding a stabilization account to be sure that future years of the Student Opportunity Act can be funded. And so the $5 or so million from last year and the $6 million from FY'24 are sustained over time. The foundation budget being increased is also sustained over time. That expectation that education costs more is sustained over time. And we're accountable for the spending of the Chapter 70 monies. Barnstable submitted an initial 3-year spending plan to the department in FY'21. It was the fall of 20, kind of during the height of COVID. You may or may not remember that moment. It was initially due that spring, and then it was postponed. Annual amendments are submitted each spring. Assistant Superintendent Kristen Harmon and I are currently working on this year's amendment based on FY'23 spending, and we are accounting for expenditures towards evidence-based programs to support students and close opportunity and achievement gaps. We will need to submit a new 3-year spending plan to the department in FY'24, so I anticipate that happening in the fall. There is an expectation, that there's stakeholder involvement and stakeholder engagement and awareness of what the funds are going to support. I will say the initial spending plan that Barnstable submitted was the so-called short form, because initially the Chapter 70 monies that were expected to be received were under $1.5 million incrementally, but because of the rapid and quick shift in the economically disadvantaged population in particular, that moved Barnstable into a new category, and we will be completing the long form of the plan. So for the reasons that I have kind of outlined in terms of the intent and the spirit of the law and the reason for the additional monies, I really encourage the school committee to support the recommended budget. We certainly are open to your input on individual lines and some of these requests, but I feel like there's a really compelling case here for the increase of 7.8% to invest as intended with the Student Opportunity Act, the strategic priorities and initiatives focused on closing achievement and opportunity gaps. I'm going to turn it over to Chris to share a little bit of the financials.
Thank you, Sarah. So this graph just shows a 7-year, year-over-year high-level overview of spending toward the school budget. In the far right, you'll see where we land for the projected FY'24 budget. So a little under $83 million is coming from the general fund, and we've got 2 offsets, a little over $2 million from the circuit breaker, and then $600,000 coming from school choice to offset the overall budget. Given the increase in aid that Sarah has just mentioned, we don't anticipate needing any school savings to produce a balanced budget for this year. You saw this slide earlier. It just gives you a year-over-year glimpse between this year's proposed budget and last year's, coming in at just under 8%. This is a different view of the proposed budget, broken down by the DESE categories that we are required to track our spending. So one category is by school site, and all the school sites are listed here. You see a 3-year history, 3 years of actual spending, last year's approved budget, and then this year's recommended budget. And this next slide is another view. This is by the major cost categories, from administration all the way down to pupil services. Your largest category here is related to instruction, but again, you see the FY'23 budgeted amount, or approved amount, I should say, and the proposed FY'24 amount.
The next set of slides detail recommendations regarding investment initiatives or enrichments to the budget, which came from cost centers and have been prioritized. There were over $4 million of requests, so this does not reflect everything that was put forward, but does, I think, really support the requests of principals and directors, and ultimately really focused on students. You'll see some themes here, but I would like to, for the benefit of the community, go through all of these items in particular, because we do have the budget hearing. You have the budget hearing later tonight. So a new mandate that is coming from the Department of Education, which not all mandates are bad. I think this is one that's one worth supporting, is the addition of an English as a second language teacher at our preschool. Previously, that had only been a requirement K through 12, and there is some new language in their guidance documents about providing language-based support in classrooms at the pre-K level, and we are seeing a number of they call them dual language learners, which I think is awesome, dual language learners at the pre-K level. Many of our buildings have requested family and community liaisons who would be bilingual support. We do have a number of family and community liaisons in the district, but we do not have enough in terms of providing translation and interpretation services in the moment related to family engagement. So there is a half-time liaison proposed for the Early Learning Center. There is a discrepancy across our K-3 schools in terms of teaching assistants to support our youngest learners. We're seeing an increased number of students coming in kindergarten and grade 1 who are not fully ready for school, and providing additional support in the classrooms will only be helpful to our teachers and ultimately to our students. The positions that are proposed in this budget are not at all schools. Again, there's a discrepancy and an inequity, so this aims to kind of level the playing field, so to speak, across buildings. Not to say that every building's going to have exactly the same. There are demographic differences between the buildings. Some are larger, some are smaller, but that has been taken into account. I would underscore the importance of assistant principals in our buildings. The previous budget was kind of a modest incremental approach to adding assistant principals K-3. This recommended budget would propose that each of our K-3 elementary schools would now have a full-time assistant principal. They are, I think, critical in terms of instructional leadership in support of the principal and in support of every single teacher and every single student in the school. I also think that they can do a lot related to helping teach students appropriate behaviors, and can support in so many different ways. So I have requests here related to assistant principals at each of our elementary schools, which currently is in inequity because some have them and some have part-time and some do not have any. Looking ahead, I'm now looking at Centerville. Again, you see a request for teaching assistants to support our learners there and an assistant principal. Centerville has also requested, and I support, a social worker. This would create more equity across our K-3 schools. When we look at the counseling and social work staff, there is an inequity there, so this would level that playing field. Hyannis West, support of a family and community liaison, ideally trilingual. West Villages, teaching assistants and assistant principal as well. BCIS, looking to support teaching assistants there. Restoring the project-based learning coach, which is budget neutral, but that person would shift from less teaching to also being a coach of teachers, so that would necessitate the addition of a 0.8 science teacher. The positive here, too, would be more equity across our K-3 schools in terms of all of the students receiving science instruction more equitably, and an assistant principal there. BUE has requested math interventionists and reading interventionists. Although it's not in the operating budget, we have proposed for it to be grant funded, and would be a preview for something that I think would be supported longer term in the budget. BUE has a number of students, and Assistant Superintendent Harmon will talk a little bit more about STAR data and growth, but they have a number of students who would qualify for intervention, and we do have a need for more educators working to close skill gaps at grade 4-5. They are also looking for a family and community liaison, which we support, and there is a need for a special education additional paraprofessional at BUE. BIS has requested a family and community liaison, which is something that I recommend. BIS, and you've heard about this in previous presentations, is looking to expand their enrichment offerings and fully schedule students with a nice complement, I think, of enrichments. When I interviewed, one of the questions that the BIS students asked me was, what would you think about putting world language in our school? It is something the students are looking for and would better connect the students to the high school where we are offering world language. And I think help meet, we don't have our vision of a graduate, but we will, but help our students in our multicultural world. Yep.
Do we have any other languages being taught at any levels until high school? I mean, do we have anything in the elementary schools or
Nope,
anything?
it's
or-
all 8 through 12 right now.
So it doesn't start till grade 8?
Yep.
Okay. That's a shame. Thank you.
I'm a big supporter of elementary languages, and so maybe something worth considering in the future. It's hard to start all at once in terms of staffing, but it could be an incremental approach. At BIS, they also are looking for a STEM teacher, again, to expand their offerings of enrichment classes. This STEM teacher would align with the high school, again, kind of creating that 6, 7, and 8 connection from a curriculum standpoint. They have 2 PBL specialists at BIS. One was grant funded, and so we thought we would kind of lose that position, but we have an extension of the grant, so we'll be able to keep that person on staff for another year. We have a number of requests for bilingual paraprofessionals to support students at BIS and BHS. So there are 7 positions related to that. They can provide direct support to students in classes. We also anticipate being able to use some of the donation from the kind donor who gave money to support our multilingual learner program to provide any training or education for any paras who may want to grow into a teacher role, because we do need more ESL teachers as well. We are continuing forward with the peer mediator at the high school, although we propose for that to be grant funded through ESSER. And I think there's maybe a misstep with the finances here, but we have proposed a multilingual para for English learners in, I'm sorry, it's just a double line, sorry, in math classes at the high school. We have a lot of newcomers and beginners among our older students. Continuing on with additional recommendations to support students would be a special education teacher in the foundations classes at the high school. We had talked about this at the workshop, where we're seeing that program expand, and with 5 grades of students and a multitude of subjects that they need, we need another teacher in the foundations classroom. Ms. Friedman's top request is to have a department head for the ESL department, which would come in at half an FTE. It is the only department at the high school that does not have a department head, and I think given the demands in the district related to ESL, it is a lot for the coordinator to do district-wide. So this is something that is needed, and I support. Mentioned the ESL paraprofessionals previously. We have a bilingual counselor at Barnstable High School currently. She's amazing. Ms. Friedman is looking to expand that, given the number of students who are in our high school who are multilingual learners. This next one is the Crossroads teacher. You have previously approved this position, but this formally accounts for it in the budget. We did not end up filling it, but we would like to. I think that it would be able to greatly expand the program offerings, and having the model would continue to have ingenuity, but with an additional teacher, provide more direct teaching from that teacher within that program. And then, as was asked at the time that was approved, we would request, and this is not currently something that you had voted on, an additional paraprofessional for Crossroads. BHS is also seeking and requesting and needing an additional special education teacher to support students with more moderate disabilities. One area of kind of vulnerability and weakness that we have is related to our instructional technology, and a huge amount of instructional technology that flooded into our schools as a result of the pandemic and of COVID, and sometimes it can be difficult to maintain and keep track. We only have 3 people district-wide who work in the instructional technology department, and they are not building-based. So this proposal, which I've seen work very well, is to have a building-based inventory clerk at the high school who is monitoring our assets and making sure that we're seeing a return of the Chromebooks at the high school. It'll ultimately be a wise investment. Otherwise, we are on the hook for anything that we don't get back, and because we lease them and have to return them at the end. We are proposing 2 additional FTEs in the maintenance department. As noted in the workshop, the maintenance department has not seen an increase in the budget since 2016. This was one of the areas that was initially not proposed for funding when we thought we had a more conservative revenue model, but we are proposing 2 additional craftsmen to assist with maintenance of our buildings. I think we don't have the facilities conditions assessment, but I think that assessment would support it. And then a district-wide family and community liaison. There are some of our smaller schools and district efforts that could use that additional support in the district. And so the recommended addition here is $2.1 million of salaries and wages. We had also broken up requests and recommendations into operating categories. And so we'll run through those. As noted, there are some curriculum investments proposed. One is pre-K curriculum materials and professional development. We are accounting for some of the high school requests and proposing some grant funding, although some of these we may want to consider for longer-term investments. We do still have some ESSER money that we can spend in very limited categories. So we're proposing to fund Ingenuity online classes, which is currently not in the budget, but we use, so we need to account for it, through ESSER, providing additional MCAS support through ESSER funding, stipending an after-school support position in 4 core subjects through ESSER funding, and then jumping ahead, the science and engineering, MCAS prep and intervention in February and June through ESSER funding, all of which would be allowable with the idea that it's taking into consideration pandemic effects on learning. The athletic coach positions that you see here would formally add unified track and unified basketball into your budget, which I think is a wonderful addition, and I can't wait for the unified track season in a few weeks. The high school is preparing to undergo the accreditation process. That accreditation process has changed a little bit. It's a little less onerous than it used to be, but we do still have to host some visitors to our school, as well as provide stipends to staff for leading the accreditation process. And so that is proposed at $12,000 for this year, and I think there will be a second year of expenses in FY'25. I know accreditation is difficult, and we sort of stepped away from it for a little bit, but there is, I think, a reason to take it up now, particularly as we consider the JROTC program. The application does ask about your accreditation, and so it does carry some weight for other reasons. Yep.
I just have a question about Didn't he ask a credit? So it carries some weight there. Are schools required to get, by state law or anything, to get accredited? Or do we have to get an accreditation through some sort of?
I'm not aware of any law. No. I think that there are places in which it gets examined. So it might be looked at from the college's perspective. If a student is applying, it might get looked at if somebody's looking to move into town. The JROTC program is looking as to whether or not you have accredited status in your community, but I don't know of any law that requires it.
Okay, but just as going through it a number of times, I have yet to see the benefits of this accreditation for 20 years in the business. I know what it's like going through it for a bunch of different schools, and I'll just interesting. Okay, I just thought at the beginning I thought it was something you had to do, because I was like, why are we wasting all this time? You know, but now I know that you don't have to do it. But I mean, that's all I was wondering. Thank you.
Sure. Ms. Friedman has identified some additional areas that she would like to support through site-based funds. This would include things like some funding to support students on field trips who might not be able to afford them. Also, some recognition programs at the high school to build positive spirit and culture. We have a need for translation and interpretation services in the special education department. We have a number of areas here, and be happy to go into more detail related to proposed professional development. But one thing that I noticed coming in new that I don't see that I've seen in other budgets are kind of specific line items to support PD in particular areas that are district priorities or needed by our educators. So in special education, they're looking to formally provide PD for paraprofessionals, related service providers, and safety care. Google Workspace for Education is increasing in cost, so that is proposed at $15,000. We have some inflationary pressures for gasoline and diesel, and an anticipated increase in out-of-district transportation, a need for more bus monitors. We are also proposing to increase contracted services for maintenance and the maintenance reserve. We are not hitting the requested amount, but again, trying to incrementally increase that. The original increase that you saw at the workshop was 5%, and this doubles that to 10% of its current amount in the budget. That also pertains to custodial supplies as well as 10% for vehicle leasing. I am proposing that we hire a consultant to continue on with facilities planning. The facilities conditions assessment will also take into account an enrollment forecast, so we can do some long-term planning in the district. Attorney Moynihan has been working to consolidate all of our contracts and unify them, streamline them, make sure they are legally sound. And so we are proposing contract management software to manage that. I would like to run some graduate level courses across the district for leaders as well as our educators to support diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. We have a need to increase mentor stipends, so that is proposed from the Assistant Superintendent's Office. Inflation pressures on our assessment line at 5%. We have a number of teachers who are engaged in additional independent professional development through course taking, and so we've been exceeding our budget in course reimbursement, and so we have a need to kind of match the budget with our spending, so we have an increase there. Licensing costs increased in a few categories are listed there. The Assistant Superintendent has proposed professional development to support curriculum development, particularly as we think about aligning towards the vision of a graduate. Testing and assessment supplies going up for student services. We have a nurse that is currently grant funded at FCEC, and that grant is ending. We are not going to put this in the general fund. We do see that ESSER could continue to support the nurse and the nursing services at our Family and Community Engagement Center. And then the last two increase the interpreters' budget lines for EL services and increasing texts and curriculum materials. A lot of that's licensing costs for ELs, and we need to increase that because we have more students for a total of $793,639. We do have some reductions proposed in the budget. We have some one-time expenses from last year, including AP Human Geography texts, some seed money for Hawk's Nest Supplies, which is a school store at the high school, the Centerville Go Swing, and the high school cabinet replacement in the art department. And then in terms of salaries and wages, the Centerville Library Assistant had been a .8, looking to put that at .5, which is consistent with FTEs at our other buildings. And then with the addition of .8 science at BCIS and the PBL coach position, reducing the technology teacher from 1.0 to .6 based on the number of sections that they have there. I'm going to turn it over to Chris to talk a little bit about the revolving funds.
Thanks, Sarah. This slide just gives you a little bit more detail about the offsets that were highlighted in the earlier slide that showed the overall budget for FY'24. So on your left is our school choice numbers, our FY'22 actual, FY'23 budget, and FY'24 proposed. We, as mentioned earlier, are budgeting for a $600,000 offset, which leaves us with a balance in that fund of approximately $1.6 million. And then our circuit breaker number has come in at a little over $2 million. That will be applied to next year's budget as an offset. We're estimating next year at this point to come in at just under $2 million at 1.95.
And lastly, in conclusion, I captured this quote from Maura Healey, our governor, that the Student Opportunity Act calls for a historic investment in our schools, our students, our educators, and their futures. And I think this budget reflects that. We're happy to answer any questions. And I'll stop there.
Excellent. Excellent presentation. Thank you very much. So I'll open it up. Does anybody have any questions? Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, I just wonder if I didn't see anything about substitute teachers. How are we doing with filling subs now? Are we having any issues with that? I don't, unless I missed it, I didn't see any sub things going on. How's the world of substitutes
We
going?
did make an adjustment in the budget related to subs. I'll ask Chris to chime in on the details with that.
Yeah, we've added $40,000 to two particular sites. It was BUE and maybe BWB, where we looked at the numbers and needed to increase those this year to account for what we've been currently spending. But the total increase is $40,000 proposed.
I think it's still a struggle in terms of filling some of those substitute positions. I think it's better, but it does seem to be kind of a constant look, a constant review. We're kind of bringing new people in, and we've gotten more flexible. So to be considered a building-based sub, for example, it was we expect you here all 5 days every day, and there are some folks who said, well, we can be there 4 days consistently, and we've kind of said that it meets
4
the
is better than
spirit.
0.
Yeah, it meets the spirit of a building-based sub, and so we've exercised a little bit of flexibility to try to recruit some people.
And do you know if you've spoke with the subs, is there issues with, do we lose subs to other districts? Is it competitive? Is it local? I mean, it seems to be what I hear sometimes. And I know as a teacher that when your aide has to go cover someone, it's two things. One, you don't have your aide that you rely on to help you with the students, and then it's kind of a message that their job's not that important, so they can go sub. And it's kind of a little bit of a morale killer. So I don't know how often that's happened. Do we have any data on how often we're not getting classes covered?
Yeah, I think we do have some data, but fortunately, as it relates to paraprofessionals getting pulled, we have worked out an agreement with the union where individual teachers can volunteer to go on a sub list. This works particularly well at the intermediate school and the high school, and they can give up their prep period and get compensated for the hour for the additional work as a sub. And so that I think improved upon a situation previously where people were getting pulled from PLCs and such, and that prevents paras from getting pulled as much. Does it happen? It does. It is not something that we want to do. It's kind of a last resort. But that has helped us be a little bit more flexible with subs. But I think it's still hard. I don't think it's easy.
I agree. Thank you.
I'll step down it. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, yeah.
So it's just related to the subs. So for the site that you weren't able to get the full-time and you have the .8 permanent sub, are you able to fill the .2 by any chance with a regular person for 1 day a week?
I don't think they've been able to do that,
They just
no.
haven't been
Yeah.
able to get a commitment?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
But we're open to that if anybody's watching.
Andre, do you have any questions about the budget process in general, or well, the presentation?
I do, and it was a thorough presentation for me. I'm interested in this, the shift in terms of having more administrators across our elementary schools. You noted a need, and for me, I'm seeing additional focus and lens towards curriculum development, having an additional administrator there. And I think that would also, in terms of lessening the load for those principals, lend itself to further community engagement in terms of reaching out, strengthening those bonds. Talked about Gateway as a program that is widening its scope in the district in terms of accessibility, and will continue to do so. So that's how I'm seeing it. Could you maybe elaborate more? Because it appears that under the leadership of Governor Maura Healey, that it's clear that investment is a top priority. And that's backing up with some, I think you noted that the increase, 32.32, was the largest in the state. And so we're looking, that's refreshing. And so I'm starting, we're going to add, we'll add administrators at the younger level, which can free up those principals there to then further engage, encourage, inspire our families, which should be go directly correlate to our students. So that's very encouraging. But if you want to speak further to that, and then just my follow-up, just kind of along with that, is in terms of supporting students and closing achievement gaps and opportunities, you've mentioned a lot of staff-based investment. How does that balance with the facilities, the investment in our facilities, which I know is critical at some of the elementary schools?
Those are great questions. I think you've identified, an additional piece around the benefit of having more assistant principals at the K-3 schools, and with identifying family engagement, for example, is something that the principals would be freed up to do. And I think that's one example that could be expanded on. An assistant principal really so many times focuses on the operations and the day-to-day, leaving the principal to be more strategic. Not that they wouldn't be focusing on operations and day-to-day, but being more strategic, working with teachers, that instructional leadership, providing feedback and opportunities for growth, communication with our community, collaboration with our PTOs. So I think that there are a lot of opportunities that would be raised by having the assistant principals in the buildings. And I see the difference, I think, in terms of what we currently have, where we have schools with assistant principals or half-time assistant principals and schools that don't. And I think creating equity and creating more opportunities for each and every family, each and every community would be one benefit coming from that. The other note that you mentioned was around facilities and the balance. I think it's a great question. 10% might not be enough, and 2 people might not be enough. I think that's something, when we have more data from the facilities conditions assessment and have a better understanding of the scope of the recommendations from there, I think we could be a bit more kind of concrete in terms of what our needs are. But I think the 10% increase in 2 positions is a step in the right direction.
Joe, do you have any other questions?
Yeah, just a bravo to the new funding formula. It's a step in the right direction. However, I don't think it's going to. I think we're still going to fall short. And I think it's important for the public to know when a student's classified as high needs. If you have if you know someone or you have a child with special needs, just some students take more care and need more support to help them in all different ways, and that costs money because it costs FaceTime with adults to be there, or with equipment to help them, or tutors. There's lots of things that happen. Or if a student isn't speaking English, we need to help these students out. So our students are more, we have an increase of almost 50% in high needs. It was from like 44% to 70, almost doubled the number of high needs students in the last 10 years. So when people look at the budget, they're going to say things like, oh, this percent, oh, why is it costing X, Y, and Z? It's because our students, our neighbors, our children have more needs. So we need to meet them and help them. That's what we do. That's what schools do. So we educate all the children. And that's all. I think, I hope it's people outside of the schools have trouble seeing that. They don't work with students that have, or maybe if they don't have a child with special needs, they don't know. So that's where a lot of the money is going, is that we're trying to help our kids.
Can I respond to that? Just
Yeah, sure.
quantitatively, I'd love to add maybe some numbers to Joe's point around it doesn't quite feel like enough. The foundation budget's going up 11.84%. That's what the state is saying is an adequate education. Now, we're paying more than foundation now by about 24, last year I think it was 24 or 26%. So the foundation is going up, but our expense isn't going up 11.84%, it's going up 7.8%. So that bar that's been set for Barnstable isn't going up at the same rate as the foundation budget is going up. So those would be some comparisons and numbers to perhaps keep in mind.
And compared to other school districts, are we similar ballpark of per pupil spending, or is it?
No, we are, so I did take a look in the region, and our per pupil spending in the region is low, as is that amount over the foundation budget.
Okay.
Can I just jump on that exact thing? So so our per pupil is the lowest on Cape? Is that correct? Yes.
Yeah.
And with this new with this new Opportunity Act saying that it's more expensive to educate kids, we went up, I'm sorry, you were throwing out a lot of numbers.
Sorry,
So 11%?
11.8%
Okay, so
is the foundation.
Okay, so we pay the least amount for kids, for our students, but that number, the state is saying we should be paying more than did anybody else go up 11.82% on Cape Cod?
I don't believe so. I didn't look
Okay.
exactly at that, but I would be very
So we have the
surprised.
most high needs kids on the Cape.
Yes.
Would that
That's what
be a
the
fair
state is saying.
assessment
Yep.
of where we're at? Because that's why we went up 11.82%.
And 32% in Chapter 78, yep.
Right, okay. So I just wanted to make that point. Just, Kathy, I'll go to you and then I'll ask my questions. Go ahead. It's your turn.
So most of my questions have already been asked in previous workshops and school committee meetings. I want to jump on about the assistant principals. Another benefit to increasing and making sure we have enough assistant principals is mentoring to move within the district, to move up within the district. It's difficult to acquire staff. So by having these additional assistant principals, I think we may be able to have a better succession plan going down the road. Historically, we've had great retention with our staff, and so given how tough it is in the education market these days, I think it's really important for our student body to see how when they recognize a face, such as the newer principals who were teachers in their buildings, and that may give them an incentive to go into education and pursue that as a lifelong career. So I think it benefits us from the administration point of view, but I think it also benefits our district looking down the road to filling vacant positions. I really did not have any additional questions. I know I pestered the heck out of Chris. He did provide me with some extra detail. I think that your presentation was extremely thorough and transparent. I hate that word because I think if you have to tell people it's transparent, you shouldn't. But I mean, the booklet was great, a great addition to our materials up front, and the additional answers to the questions were on target, and I'm all set for tonight.
Thank you.
One more day to go.
So I just have, so first of all, I think I want to say for the public this is a lot of money. So I want people to realize, I know you said it at the beginning, but I want to underscore it again. Yeah, we're asking a few questions here and there, but this has been going on. I think this is probably our 6th, 7th, 8th maybe meeting about this. We've had workshops. We've been doing a lot. Yeah, you come and give the presentation to the public, but there's been a lot of stuff that we do at public workshops, but no one comes and they're not televised. So I just want to know, just make it blatantly clear and abundantly clear to the public that this is not something, in our vote on April 5th, we may have some more questions, but it tends by that point to be not a lot of questions. It's more about the changes. But this has been going on, even us asking questions as it's been formulated. So I want to make that abundantly clear. One thing I do want to also, about proving things, and not that I think people think that we're lying or anything, that our demographics are changing or anything like that. But one thing that I know we voted on last summer that I think probably a lot of people don't realize is kids used to pay for lunch. Kids used to pay for lunch at every school except for I think maybe 2 schools in the district. I think there might have been 1 school in the district, and then I think it might have gone to 2 over the years where there was free lunch. And the federal government, I believe, has come out. So we have the state saying that we need more money for the high needs kids. We have the federal government came out this summer and said our high needs kids are economically disadvantaged. We hit a trigger number that allowed the entire district to go free and reduced lunch or free lunch. And I think that can't be overstated enough, because you know what? It isn't the Cape of 30 years ago. It's changed, and and I think some people don't realize that, and stuff like ELL. We've over the last bunch of years we've almost developed another school system within our school system, because there are people that are only ELL teachers. We have ELL staff, quite a bit of them, as you can see by the numbers, that weren't there 10 years ago. So that's a whole nother school system for ELL to transition them from ELL to, so they're not ELL anymore. So I think people need to realize that that's a big change, and that costs money. So it's changed. And like I said, for me, the biggest change that people can see is every one of our schools, every one of our kids no longer has to pay for lunch. So the state government's saying that we've changed, and the federal government told us last summer we've changed for at least economically disadvantaged. And that's one of the, as you said, the numbers. So I'm supporting your bar graph. I want to put it in real terms, because the bar graph is a bar graph, but you know what? Real terms, every kid in the town of Barnstable, because we hit that threshold with the federal government, every kid in the town of Barnstable gets a free lunch. So I just think that can't be overstated. Other than that, I do like the budget, because I know I think a bunch of us over the years have said that we want money. Like, there seem to be a lot more people that weren't working with kids. And I'm like, and I'll speak only for myself, that and I know Joe's shaking his head, because I remember Joe and Kathy, but this is a really kid-centered budget.
All the positions. There
There is not a lot of administration or kids, as I say, people who don't work with kids. And I like that, because I think for a while, for my opinion, we were getting too much there and not enough with this. But this budget is, I mean, you got to have some supports, and I get that, but it wasn't heavy on supports. It was, we're hiring a lot of people, or we would potentially could be hiring a bunch of people, but it's centered on the kids, because that's the staff we need. Our enrollment's going up, and therefore that's what it's for. So I appreciate the fact that it's very student and kid oriented. I think that's a great thing. And my frustration over the last few years has definitely been answered in this budget. So thank you. Anybody else have any questions?
One
Yeah,
more
go ahead,
quick
Joe.
thing. This was awesome. I love this line item. I mean, this was the one we've been dreaming about for so long. And so this was fantastic. And I just want to make sure I got it straight with what Mike said. So the foundation budget calculation says we should be spending the most per pupil on the Cape, but pretty much.
I'd like to be sure that I did not look at the foundation budgets in area communities, but ours is going up the most.
Yes,
Yep.
but we're spending the least. So what
We're
about
spending the least per pupil, yep.
okay? And then And similar districts off Cape, have you done any comparisons to similar sized districts off Cape also? Just curious. Similar size, similar makeup. Do you have any
So I
numbers
could
like
do that and.
Yeah, if you could just
get
bring
the
that back
con-
just
yeah,
at the
yeah,
April,
absolutely.
Curious.
Yeah,
Yeah,
there
just
there is
because
some
we've kinda always-
information. There's some information in the October presentation around per pupil cost comparing like
remember seeing it,
Marlboro.
yeah.
Marlboro's per pupil is lower, so there were some regional comparisons, and we're kind of in line with Marlboro, but I can get some information about their foundation increase and Chapter 70 increase.
I'm most concerned I was about Cape because that's
Yeah,
like competing
yeah.
schools and that's where students are going to. So, all right, awesome. Thank you so much. Awesome job, both of you guys. Thanks.
I did look at their Chapter 70 increases, and nobody's near 30%. DY would come in second, and they're more, I think, in the 10 to 15 range, 10 to 15%.
Any other questions, Kathy?
I don't have any questions, but I see some of our building administrators in the audience in our department, and I want to thank you for coming. I know you're the veterans, so you know I would call you out on your building budgets, and so you had the backbone to show up tonight, and I
Wow.
really appreciate seeing you, and I appreciate all you do for the students of Barnstable. So thank you for attending, and lucky for you, no questions about SPED or High West or Centerville, so you're good.
When I said to Kathy, every one of them held their breath, Kathy. No other questions?